Picture this, if you will. It's May 1968, and while the rest of America is watching Walter Cronkite report on Vietnam and students rioting in Paris, a 51-year-old man with calloused hands and Iowa farm sense is stepping off a float plane onto the shores of Upper Twin Lake in Alaska. The pilot who dropped him there probably looked back as he flew away, wondering if he'd just delivered another dreamer to his death. Dick Proenneke wasn't your typical back-to-the-land enthusiast. This wasn't some college kid with romantic notions about wilderness living. This was a Navy carpenter who'd spent 5 years, planning every detail of what seasoned Alaskan builders were calling an impossible mission. And when I say impossible, I mean the kind of impossible that makes grizzled old-timers in Port Ellsworth place actual money on how quickly this crazy Iowa farm boy would come running back to civilization. What was his plan? Oh, just to build a cabin entirely, by hand, alone, using only tools he could carry in his backpack and what the forest provided. In Alaska, where winter temperatures drop to 40 below zero and darkness swallows the world for 20 hours a day. Now, you have to understand the context here. This is 1968 Alaska we're talking about, not some tourist destination with helicopter rescues on speed dial. This is raw, unforgiving wilderness where the nearest neighbor might be 100 miles away, and that neighbor is probably a grizzly bear with an attitude problem. The kind of place where making one serious mistake doesn't just ruin your day, it ends your story permanently. But Dick Proenneke had something that separated him from the dreamers who'd tried and failed before him. His childhood during the Great Depression had forged him in a different fire than most men of his generation. While other kids were playing with store-bought toys, young Dick was in his father's Iowa workshop, learning that human hands could create anything, if guided by patience, skill, and the kind of stubborn determination that refuses to accept the word impossible. His diesel mechanic job at the naval bases in Kodiak had done more than provide him with a steady pension. It had shown him the wild heart of Alaska, where mountains don't just rise from the earth, they explode upward like frozen tsunamis, touching a sky so vast it makes you question everything you thought you knew about scale, where silence isn't just the absence of noise, but a living thing broken only by wolf song that echoes off glacial valleys. Proenneke had chosen Twin Lakes after methodical research that would make a military strategist proud. He'd flown over dozens of remote locations, studying topography, water sources, timber quality, and weather patterns. This wasn't romantic wandering, this was scientific site selection. He found his perfect spot where the Chillicothe River flowed between two pristine lakes, surrounded by spruce forests thick enough and straight enough for building. The kind of building he had in mind. When local bush pilots learned what he intended to do, they didn't just shake their heads. They actively tried to talk him out of it. These were men who'd seen tough guys, really tough guys, broken by Alaskan winters. Men who knew that the wilderness doesn't care about your plans, your experience, or your determination. It only cares about your mistakes, and it remembers every single one. But here's what those pilots didn't know about Dick Proenneke. He wasn't just carrying tools in his carefully planned cache. He was carrying something much more dangerous to the forces that break other men. He was carrying the absolute conviction that what he planned to do wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. That first summer, living under a tarp shelter while he cleared his building site, Proenneke began what locals would later call the impossible cabin. Not impossible because it couldn't be built, impossible because of how he planned to build it. A structure so precisely crafted it would need no chinking between logs, no modern materials, no compromises with convenience. A cabin that would still stand perfect after 50 years of Arctic storms, built by one man with hand tools and a vision that bordered on obsession. As he swung his axe that first morning, with 20 hours of Alaskan daylight stretching ahead and the nearest human being further away than most people travel in a day, Dick Proenneke was about to prove something that would change wilderness building forever. He was about to prove that impossible is just another word for hasn't been done yet. Asterisk. The sound of his axe biting into ancient spruce would echo across those lakes for months to come, but the techniques he was about to develop would echo across generations. Asterisk. As July sunshine stretched into those surreal 20-hour Alaskan days, Dick Proenicke began what can only be described as a revolution in wilderness construction. But revolutions, real revolutions, don't announce themselves with fanfare. They begin quietly, with one person doing something so fundamentally different that everyone else thinks they're crazy, until they see the results. Every morning at exactly 4:30, and when you have 20 hours of daylight, 4:30 feels like an arbitrary human construct. Proenicke emerged from his temporary tarp shelter to begin what looked like a ritual. He'd walk among the spruce trees with the deliberate pace of a jeweler selecting diamonds, running his hands along bark, listening, and I mean actually listening, to what the wood was telling him. You see, this is where most people get wilderness building completely wrong. They think it's about conquering nature, imposing human will on the forest. Proenicke understood something that master craftsmen have known for millennia. The wood tells you what it wants to become. You just have to be patient enough to listen. He chose only trees that had grown straight and true through decades of brutal Alaskan winters, trees that had survived ice storms that would snap lesser timber like matchsticks, trees that had stood their ground against winds that could knock a grown man flat. These weren't just building materials, they were survivors, and Proenicke needed survivors for what he was planning. His double-bit axe, which he'd affectionately named Old Faithful, bit into wood with the kind of rhythmic precision that comes from decades of practice. But here's what separated Proenicke from every other wilderness builder in Alaska. He wasn't just cutting down trees. He was conducting an orchestra of wood, steel, and human determination. Each tree that fell had been selected for a specific purpose. This one for the foundation sill, because its grain ran perfectly straight. That one for corner posts, because it had grown slowly, creating dense, strong wood. Another for roof logs, because it had the exact taper he needed. Nothing was random. Nothing was wasted. Everything was planned with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that drives most people insane, but creates miracles in the hands of a master. Then came the magic. The part that would make professional builders travel thousands of miles just to see if the stories were true. Proenicke's notching technique wasn't just different, it was revolutionary. Where traditional cabin builders left gaps that required chinking with moss, mud, or whatever they could stuff between logs, Proenicke carved each log to nestle perfectly against its neighbor. I'm talking about tolerances so tight that you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. Joints so precise they created walls that breathed like living wood, while keeping out Arctic winds that could freeze a man solid. He spent entire days on single notches. Entire days. While mosquitoes the size of small aircraft tried to carry him away, and grizzly bears investigated his worksite, drawn by the sweet smell of fresh-cut spruce. Picture this man, alone in the wilderness, banging pots and singing old Navy songs to claim his territory from 800-pound predators, then going right back to carving wood with the patience of a monk illuminating manuscripts. His tools became extensions of his own body through 10, 12, sometimes 14-hour workdays, the adze that shaped logs flat as dining room tables, the hand auger that drilled perfect holes for wooden pins. Wooden pins, because metal hardware was for people who didn't understand that wood talks to wood in ways that steel never could. The crosscut saw that sang through timber with a rhythm that became the soundtrack of his obsession. But here's what really set Proenicke apart from every other builder in Alaska, maybe in all of North America. He understood that building wasn't just about creating shelter, it was about creating something that would outlast the man who built it. Something that would stand, as proof that human hands, guided by patience and wisdom, could achieve perfection. By August, as the first yellow appeared in birch leaves like nature's early warning system for the coming winter, walls rose log by log in what can only be described as a meditation of measurement and muscle. Each log was positioned with the care most people reserve for handling newborn babies. Each notch was carved with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Each joint was tested and retested until it achieved that mythical status of perfect. Evening thunderstorms, the kind that make the mountains echo with sound like artillery bombardments, tested his craftsmanship nightly. Lightning split the sky. Rain hammered down with the fury of nature, reminding humans who's really in charge. Wind howled through the valleys with enough force to uproot trees that had stood for centuries. Not a drop of water penetrated his revolutionary joints, not one. He carved wooden hinges that would never rust, never seize, up in sub-zero temperatures, never fail when failure meant the difference between life and death. He fashioned a door so perfectly balanced it would swing open with fingertip pressure even when the frame contracted in 40 below weather. He created windows from salvaged glass that he'd somehow managed to pack in 50 miles from the nearest human settlement, setting them with a precision that would make modern window installers weep with envy. As summer began its inevitable slide toward the Alaskan winter that would test everything he'd built, Dick Proenneke was creating more than just a cabin. He was developing techniques that would change wilderness building forever. Techniques so radical, so precise, so fundamentally sound that they would influence construction for generations to come. But he had no idea that his spring-wound Bolex 16mm camera, which he kept running back and forth to film himself working, was creating the first comprehensive visual record of something that would spark a revolution across an entire continent. Word of Proenneke's impossible precision spread through Alaska's bush pilot network like wildfire through dry tundra. And in Alaska, bush pilots are the equivalent of medieval messengers. They carry news, gossip, and legends from one remote outpost to another across distances that would make ancient empires seem like neighborhood walks. By September 1968, as Proenneke prepared to raise massive ridge logs alone, using only wooden levers and rope, a feat that should have required a crew of 6 strong men, pilots were deliberately detouring over Twin Lakes just to glimpse the madman, who was apparently rewriting the rules of construction. They'd circle overhead, watching this solitary figure manipulating logs that weighed hundreds of pounds with the same ease most people move furniture. But here's where Proenneke made a decision that transformed him from skilled craftsman into accidental revolutionary. The choice to document every step with his spring-wound Bolex 16mm camera wasn't vanity. It was the methodical mind of a man who understood that knowledge dies with the person who possesses it unless it's passed on. Running back and forth to film himself working, setting up shots, rewinding the camera, repositioning for better angles, he was unknowingly creating the first comprehensive visual record of traditional building techniques enhanced by one man's innovations. Those grainy 16mm films would eventually change everything, but first, they had to survive the Alaskan wilderness along with their creator. Professional builders started arriving by float plane in late September, expecting to find another dreamer's inevitable failure. Instead, they discovered something that challenged everything they thought they knew about construction. Joints so tight they couldn't slip a knife blade between logs, corners so perfectly square they defied belief. A structure rising with the kind of precision that modern machinery struggled to achieve, crafted entirely by hand tools and human determination. Master craftsman Roy Vanelstein flew in from Anchorage, a man who'd built more wilderness lodges than anyone in Alaska, who'd seen every shortcut and technique developed over decades of frontier construction. He spent 3 days studying Proenneke's methods, measuring joints, testing the stability of walls, examining the revolutionary notching system. When he flew back to Anchorage, he carried something more valuable than gold, knowledge that would revolutionize his own building company. Vanelstein immediately began incorporating Proenneke's techniques into his commercial projects. The slow way, as he called it, actually saved months of future maintenance and produced structures that lasted generations longer than rushed construction. Word spread from lodge to lodge across Alaska as builders realized that this hermit's methods weren't just impressive, they were profitable. His fireplace, built from stones gathered along Emerson Creek, drew perfectly without smoking, while heating the entire cabin evenly. This might not sound revolutionary until you understand that poorly drawing fireplaces had been the bane of frontier homes for centuries. Cabins where families huddled in smoke-filled rooms, where choosing between freezing and suffocating was a nightly decision. Proenneke had solved this ancient problem with careful stone selection, precise chimney construction, and an understanding of airflow that would make modern heating engineers envious. Through the 1970s, as America discovered environmental consciousness and began questioning the wisdom of endless consumption. Proenicke's films found their way to public television producer Bob Swearer. The broadcast of One Man's Alaska in 1973 reached 15 million viewers across the continent. 15 million people watched this quiet man with calloused hands prove that human craftsmanship could surpass modern methods. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Architecture schools requested copies to study his joinery techniques. The National Park Service sent teams to document his methods for their historic preservation programs. Engineering departments analyzed his structural innovations. But most importantly, young people, inspired by his example, began heading into wilderness areas across North America, carrying dog-eared copies of building guides based on his techniques. This wasn't just about building cabins anymore. This was about rediscovering what human hands could accomplish when guided by patience and precision. In an era of mass production and planned obsolescence, Proenicke had proven that individual craftsmanship could create something approaching perfection. His cabin became more than shelter. It became proof of concept, proof that ancient wisdom combined with innovative thinking could surpass modern methods. Proof that one person, working alone with hand tools, could achieve what teams with power equipment often failed to accomplish. Proof that the so-called primitive ways weren't primitive at all. They were sophisticated beyond modern understanding. The techniques began spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Wilderness guides in the Canadian Rockies started using his notching methods. Lodge builders in Montana incorporated his window-setting techniques. Homesteaders in northern Minnesota adopted his foundation systems. Each builder added their own innovations, but the core principles remained pure. Proenicke, precision over speed, quality over convenience, permanence over profit. By the late 1970s, what had started as one man's escape from civilization had become a movement. Building schools offered courses based on his methods. Master craftsmen made pilgrimages to Twin Lakes to see the source. Young builders considered studying his techniques, as essential as learning to read blueprints. But perhaps most remarkably, Dick Proenicke himself remained largely unaware of the revolution he'd started. He was too busy living his masterpiece, maintaining his cabin with the same devotion a violinist shows a Stradivarius, and documenting the natural world around him with the same precision he'd applied to his construction. As the 1980s dawned, his cabin stood as more than just exceptional craftsmanship. It had become a shrine to what was possible when human determination met ancient wisdom in the crucible of the Alaskan wilderness. For 30 years, Dick Proenicke lived his masterpiece, maintaining his cabin with the same devotion a violinist shows a Stradivarius. This wasn't just about keeping a roof over his head. This was about proving, day after day, year after year, that perfection could endure in a world that seemed increasingly designed for obsolescence. Each spring, as ice began breaking up on Twin Lakes with sounds like artillery fire, Proenicke emerged from his winter sanctuary to conduct his annual inspection. He checked every log, examining each joint for any sign of movement or weakness. He tightened wooden pins that had weathered another brutal winter where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Where Aurora Borealis painted the sky in colors that have no names, and silence was so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. His daily journals, written in careful script by kerosene lamplight, recorded not just maintenance but philosophy, thoughts on simplicity that would make Thoreau envious, observations of the wolf packs that denned nearby, raising their young in the same wilderness that nurtured his craftsmanship. Refinements to techniques that builders worldwide now studied like sacred texts. These weren't just the musings of a hermit. They were the insights of a man who'd achieved something approaching perfection and was documenting what that meant. Visitors who made the difficult journey to Twin Lakes, and we're talking about a journey that required float planes, perfect weather, and more than a little courage, described entering his 12 by 15-foot cabin as a religious experience. Every surface showed the marks of human care and genius. The wooden door handle, worn smooth by decades of use but still functioning perfectly. The hand-carved furniture that had never wobbled, never loosened, never required repair. The windows that still opened and closed with fingertip pressure after surviving countless Arctic storms. But here's what really separated Proenike's achievement from every other wilderness success story. Time. Time is the ultimate test of any human creation, and time was proving that his primitive methods were actually more advanced than anything modern construction could produce. In 1999, at age 82, Proenike made a decision that stunned everyone who knew him. He donated his cabin to the National Park Service, ensuring that his building methods would educate forever. Think about this for a moment. A man who'd spent 30 years creating and perfecting something gave it away to preserve the knowledge for future generations. That's not just generosity. That's the act of someone who understood that true achievement belongs to humanity, not individuals. Park rangers arrived, expecting to find a historic structure in need of restoration. Instead, they discovered something that defied every principle of material science they thought they understood. After 3 decades of Arctic storms, earthquakes that rattled mountains, and temperature swings of over 100 degrees, not a single log had shifted. Not one. The roof he'd split by hand from massive spruce logs had never leaked. His handmade furniture, including a chair assembled without a single nail or screw, remained perfectly functional. The engineering reports read like fairy tales. Joints that had actually grown tighter over time as the wood aged and settled. A foundation system that had flexed with frost heaves without cracking. A heating system so efficient it warmed the entire space evenly while consuming minimal fuel. Modern architects studied these reports and quietly began incorporating his principles into million-dollar projects. Today, Proenike's cabin stands as a national historic site where 20,000 visitors annually make the pilgrimage to touch walls that changed construction forever. Master builders weep openly upon seeing joints that shouldn't be possible according to modern understanding. Architecture students measure and photograph every angle, trying to decode how one man with hand tools exceeded what contemporary technology produces. Engineering firms send teams to study his structural innovations, but the real legacy isn't just in the building techniques that now influence everything from wilderness lodges to urban tiny homes. It's in the proof that human hands, guided by patience and wisdom, can create something that transcends the merely functional and approaches the eternal. His techniques live on in wilderness schools across North America, where students learn that slow and primitive often mean superior. In architecture programs where his methods are studied alongside classical Greek construction techniques. In the remote corners of Alaska, where master builders still make pilgrimages to Twin Lakes to understand how one man redefined what was possible. When visitors stand in his cabin at sunset, with alpenglow painting volcanic mountain pink across the lake, they're experiencing more than historical preservation. They're witnessing proof that in an age of mass production and planned obsolescence, one person with vision and determination can create something that echoes through generations. Dick Proenike didn't just build shelter. He didn't just escape civilization. He proved that the highest achievements of human craftsmanship aren't found in factories or skyscrapers, but in the patient work of individuals who understand that perfection isn't a destination, it's a daily practice. His cabin stands today, 55 years after construction began, as perfect as the day he finished it. No repairs needed. No modern updates required. Still warming visitors with the same wood-burning stove, still keeping out Arctic winds with the same hand-fitted logs, still inspiring builders to reach beyond what they thought possible. In a world that measures success in quarterly profits and planned obsolescence, Dick Proenike built something that measures success in centuries. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most revolutionary thing of all. Asterisk. The sound of his axe may have faded from those Alaskan valleys, but the techniques he developed there continue to echo in workshops and wilderness cabins across the continent, proving that true innovation doesn't just solve problems, it changes how we think about what's possible. Asterisk.